Freeman seminar. I see a lot of new faces here. I'm Bob Cooterly. I'm a professor here at the Humphrey School. And every 2 weeks we have a talk at this time slot on some aspect of global policy. Now you might wonder how exactly Professor Painter's talk is global policy. Well, there are a number of ways it's global policy. Every country faces questions of optimal campaign reform, optimal campaign rules, how campaigns should be financed. We're an outlier in terms of how we do it, but that leaves open the question of how it should be done. So it's a big issue in comparative policy around the world, how campaigns are financed and how they run. That's one issue. Another issue has to do with the way in which politics and campaigns affect foreign policy, how they allow for foreign influences on the one hand, and how the way they're financed actually affects the foreign policy of the country involved. So there are a lot of connections, and we're delighted to have Professor Painter with us today. As you know, he's the S. Walter Ritchie Professor of Corporate Law at our law school here at the University of Minnesota. He's also served earlier on the faculty of the University of Oregon. I think for purposes of people in public policy, probably most interesting that from February of 2005 to July of 2007, he was associate counsel to the president in the White House counsel's office, serving as the chief ethics lawyer for the president, along with the associated people in the White House, employees and senior nominees to the Senate confirmed positions of the executive branch. I heard Professor Painter speak on this for the first time several years ago in a very, very interesting way. As most of you know, he's a prolific scholar. His book, Getting the Government America Deserves, How Ethics Reform Can Make a Difference, was published by Oxford University Press in January of 2009. He just had another book with his colleague, my colleague Claire Hill, that came out earlier this year on banking. I want to be sure I've got this right, Richard. Better Bankers, Better Banks?
Yes.
University of Chicago Press, with Claire Hill. And he's going to be talking to us today about a subject that he considered carefully during the 2014-2015 academic year when he was on leave as a fellow at Harvard's Safra Center for Ethics, thinking about campaign finance reform. His talk today is, and he'll explain what it means, taxation only with representation, the conservative conscience and campaign finance reform. Professor Painter.
Thank you very much, Bob. I am very happy to be here today to talk with you all about the campaign finance reform issue that I spent the last academic year working intensively on at Harvard. It was a wonderful year for me and for my family. Unfortunately, coming back, I got hit with a bad case of shingles, which took out the nerve on this side of my face, so I don't think that's interfered too much with my ability to talk. But if there's anything you say that you hear me say that is hard to understand, please jump in and ask questions. I also really do want to hear your views on these matters. I'm going to discuss the campaign finance reform problem that we've heard a lot about from the vantage point of people who call themselves political conservatives. Now, I worked with a lot of political conservatives. I was in the Bush White House, after all, and I've done work with the Republican Party over the years. There are some views that have been associated with conservatives or with some Republicans over the years that I strongly disagreed with, so I don't necessarily fit the characterization of a conservative in all respects. I recently been quite vocal in my opposition to Donald Trump's characterization of immigrants. It's too reminiscent for me of the earlier anti-Semitism of Richard Nixon and certain others that I'm not necessarily proud to call Republicans, at least in that respect. I have also opposed the some of the social conservatives' agendas, such as the position that was taken here in the state by a Republican Party on the issue of whether the government should be preventing people from getting married who love each other. I did not support that marriage amendment here. I supported the position of over 100 Republicans who filed a brief with the United States Supreme Court urging it to be a constitutional right to marry the person of your choice, regardless of sex. So I have differed from some people who call themselves conservatives on a number of issues, but I feel I have enough of a connection with both the Republican Party and the conservative movement in this country that I can write a book that seeks to explain to different categories of political conservatives, and I will identify those categories here in a moment, that it seeks to explain to those persons who identify with the conservative movement why, first, the campaign finance system we have today is a threat to their fundamental political principles on a range of different issues and categories. And second, that there are solutions to this problem, or at least partial solutions, that political conservatives ought to be able to buy into. And just by way of giving a peek at what I'm going to say, a preview, I do not agree with the Citizens United holding of the United States Supreme Court. I find some of the language objectionable, and I'll explain that. On the other hand, I'm not so sure that it would have made an enormous difference to our political system if that opinion had gone the other way. Skilled campaigners and lawyers were busy working their way around the McCain-Feingold provisions that were struck down by the court in that case. And indeed, when I left the Bush White House in 2007, I came here to the University of Minnesota, and my first publication was this book with Oxford University Press in 2009, Getting the Government America Deserves, How Ethics Reform Can Make a Difference. And I go through the various government ethics rules of conflicts of interest and financial interests and revolving door in and out of government. And then by the last chapter, I say, well, a lot of this isn't going to make a difference unless we fix our corrupt system of campaign finance. And I describe the state of affairs as in 2008, when I last made revisions to this book. And that was before the Citizens United decision was ever handed down. And just suffice it to say, it was a mess. It was getting worse. The Citizens United decision accelerated that process. But I think that the notion that somehow if we reverse that decision, that we're going to return to a world of orderly campaign finance, I think is somehow misguided. We need broader solutions than just that. But first, the problem, and why should political conservatives in particular recognize that there's a problem rather than consistently stick their head in the sand and ignore the problem or deny it, with the exception of Donald Trump, who will talk about it because he has so much of his own money to run for office that he doesn't need to go out and raise money to run a meeting, so he can sit on a high horse and lecture everyone else about this problem. But otherwise, we don't have this serious engagement by active candidates on the conservative end of the political spectrum with the campaign finance reform, and that's something that needs to change. We have a lot of former office holders who have been political conservatives who recognize there's a problem, and who back organizations that are calling for reform, such as Issue 1. It's a large organization. I'm going to give a speech to their lunch next week in Washington, D.C. Many former Republican and conservative office holders backing Issue 1 and their call for reform of the campaign finance system, but not current office holders on the conservative end of the political spectrum. There's another group called Take Back Our Republic that I am a board member of. And we've launched we have a good website, and we have an executive director, John Pudner, who we hired. He had just come off of the David Brat campaign that had unseated Eric Cantor, who was the, I think the number 2 man in the United States House of Representatives in the Republican caucus in a Republican primary. We thought that was very impressive, even though I strongly disagreed with some of the Democratic positions on issues. I thought John Budder was an excellent choice for this job, and John is now leading Take Back Our Republic, and this is a group of conservatives that are dedicated to cleaning up our system of campaign finance. But once again, it's very hard to get current office holders and current candidates on board with this effort, despite the arguments that I'm going to make in the book that I'm publishing early next year. We're doing this through Take Back Our Republic. This is the book that I worked on at Harvard that is titled Taxation Only with Representation. You can see that Tea Party theme there. Campaign, the conservative conscience, that's the Goldwater conscience, the conservative concept, and campaign finance reform. And speaking of Goldwater, he was one of the few Republicans holding prominent office. When he's a United States Senator, he was a candidate for President of the United States, and John McCain, being the other who have, while in office, strongly backed reform of our campaign finance system. And Barry Goldwater made it clear that he did not think that corporate money or union money ought to be injected into political campaigns. John McCain, later the candidate for President of the United States in the 2008 election, had earlier in the 1990s, when the Senate sponsored the legislation that actually tried to restrict the influx of corporate and union money and other donations from large money sources into political campaigns. So historically, we have seen an active engagement on this issue by political conservatives holding office and as candidates. But the problem is that in recent years there's been a dearth of attention to this issue, willingness to focus on it by political conservatives holding office or running for office. And of course, a large part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that the sources of the campaign money do not like a lot of what I'm about to say. So why should political conservatives oppose campaign finance in its present state? I start the book by focusing on the intent of the founders, which we hear a lot of talk about, the intent of the founders. When we have the Tea Party, we have the American Revolution, we have the Articles of Confederation, and then the Constitution. And in the book I go through the writings of many of the founding fathers and their concerns about having a participatory democracy, a Republican form of government, however you would characterize it, that was very different than the government in England from which we had rebelled in the American Revolution. The problem with the Parliament in England wasn't just that we had no representation in that Parliament, but that in England, most Englishmen did not have representation in that Parliament. It was government by the 1% and for the 1%. They had the scandals over rotten boroughs and many scandals that Edmund Burke, another founder of modern conservatism, Edmund Burke, as an MP in the Parliament, had written consistently about the corruption in Parliament, as well as the cost of elections being a large part of that corruption. So we had government by the very few in Parliament, we had costly election campaigns, corruption. These were the things that the founding fathers objected to. And it wasn't just about taxation, it was about fundamental principles of government. And we were to have a different government, a government in which the people would choose. And this meant all of the people. Now, of course, we know that in the Constitution they did not give the right to vote to women. African Americans were specifically discriminated against in the Constitution. But it was a lot broader electorate than England had ever had. And England did not achieve such a broad electorate until after the Reform Bill of 1832 in the 1860s. So when you look at the history of the American Revolution and the Constitution, certainly you can see a lot of elitism, racism, and sexism, if that's what you're looking for. You can also see a vision for a participatory democracy that's a lot broader than what England had. And I think those who politically want to talk, as we hear from many political conservatives, the importance of the vision of the Founding Fathers, we ought to look at what that vision really was and ask if our current campaign financing system is really consistent with it. Now let's get down to the specifics. If you do not believe in big government, ask yourself, where does big government come from? Government spending. Government spending is sometimes in the public interest. Political conservatives will more often than not say it's not in the public interest, and liberals will more often than not say it is, but it depends on the case. Depends on the instance. But for those who would be opposed to excessive government spending, wouldn't you want to at least eliminate government spending that occurs because campaign contributors or their lobbyists are able to bundle campaign contributions or able to get a government project that they otherwise would not get if the decisions were made on the merits? We might disagree on the merits, whether because of political ideology or the merits of the particular project, but should campaign money be what makes the difference? Whether it be a solar energy company, and we've heard many discussions of that in recent years, or it be a defense project. And of course, the spending on wasteful defense contracts is something that Republicans as well as Democrats have been very seriously engaged with. As President Eisenhower in 1961, as he was leaving office, spoke of a military-industrial complex that could drive up defense spending and also create problems for our foreign policy. The military-industrial complex, whether it's solar energy government complex, or the for-profit education industry, which feeds off student loans and has richly endowed the campaign of a certain congressman in my district, who I will not name, who is chairman of the House Education Committee. It doesn't, we could look for hundreds of examples of industries that are able to get government contracts and increase government spending as a result of campaign contributions. And then we ask about regulation. Well, the story you hear from more liberal reformers is, well, the big industries give a lot of money, so they get less regulation. And that's partially true. But then I would ask, well, why is there so much regulation? It's just we have a lot of regulation and a lot of exceptions to regulation and exceptions to exceptions. I mean, it's hard to say the banking industry is not regulated. We have 1,000 pages in the Dodd-Frank Act, on top of lots of others in the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and then tens of thousands of pages of government regulations under those acts, not to mention the prior legislation. There is tons of regulation of banks, insurance, and energy, and all sorts of things. The question is whether any of it is effective. And so, is what is going on a situation where the government, the people who hold power in government, the members of the House and Senate committees that can draft this legislation, and those in the executive branch who enforce it, know that they are in the driver's seat if they can regulate regulated industry with complex regulations, with exceptions to exceptions and the rest of it. And then if you want an exception, you need to get it into the bill in the House and Senate, or you need to get it into an agency regulation. And how do you do that? You do that through contacts with lobbyists. And the lobbyists have their contacts. Why? Well, it's not because they come empty-handed. They are bundlers. They bundle money together for politicians of both parties. And they have the influence they need. So I look at the Dodd-Frank Act, and of course you can't prove that any particular provisions can be attributed to campaign contributions. No one is that stupid to say there's going to be a quid pro quo. That would be a bribe, a quid pro quo. You go to jail for that. You wink, wink, nod, nod, and we just call it the legislative process. And you have the Dodd-Frank Act, very strict rules, and then exceptions. And exceptions that the larger financial institutions have been quite successful in working their way around, while many smaller and regional banks have struggled in the post-2010 financial environment. So it's the question of what type of regulation do we have? Has our campaign finance system really brought less regulation? Or has it created a situation where the government officials who draft the statutes, who make the rules, are in the catbird seat, and people who want their attention need to pay for it? And those who pay can work their way around the regulations and get regulations that advantage them and disadvantage competitors. Remember, not every person makes a campaign contribution wants less regulation. They may want more regulation, but it's more regulation of a competitor, and that would enable them to succeed in their business. And this is a problem that I write about in the book. I also write about the enforcement of regulations. And here the problem is most evident with state attorneys general who are actually running for office and need campaign money to run for office. And the New York Times wrote a series of articles on the state attorneys general. The Democrats would have their gathering, the state attorneys general, and the Republicans would have their gathering, and then all the contributors show up. And they would buttonhole state attorneys general about pending cases. So if the state attorney general was investigating your company, you sent a lobbyist who made the campaign contribution to the convention of either the Republican or the state attorney general. You buttonhole that state attorney general and you say, hey, what's going on? Why are you going after my client? And that's exactly what apparently happened when the Missouri attorney general was at one of these functions. One of the big energy drink manufacturers had their lawyer go up and ask, why are you investigating my client? And apparently there was contact made right then and there on a BlackBerry or some contraption with the Attorney General's office. What is going on here? Some subordinate saw to it that that investigation was dropped. Well, if that is the way it works, attorneys general can certainly bring in the campaign contributions, not by backing off of investigations. I mean, why give money to an attorney general who doesn't go and investigate and prosecute big business? You don't need to worry about them. It's the aggressive attorney general. If you start investigating, lots of people. And then, of course, those who don't pay might have a less satisfactory resolution. And this creates very perverse incentives that conservatives as well as liberals need to be worried about. And then there were other cases in which the plaintiffs' lawyers would go to a state attorney general and say, well, we know you can't afford to sue the big, whether it's the started with tobacco companies, and now it's everyone from soda manufacturers to everyone else. Well, we think you ought to bring this lawsuit. Here's a draft of the complaint. Just hire us on 20% contingency. And where do you buttonhole the attorney general? At a fundraiser. And so the New York Times wrote that out. And finally, they came out to my house in Weston, Massachusetts, to interview me. I was asking the question, what are we going to do about it? And I had written a letter to the ABA president saying that the American Bar Association ought to promulgate an ethics rule saying that prosecutors should never discuss pending investigations or pending cases at political fundraisers. I think that should be a no-brainer. And they wrote this up in the New York Times. Well, the ABA thought out the New York Times had written it up, and that they ought to respond by letter, at least. And he wrote me a letter back 3 months later saying, well, yeah, but we're worried that such a rule might interfere with the First Amendment rights of people to petition their government. I said, wait a minute. I didn't get that. We're saying an elected attorney general. So we're trying to regulate the government official. He just should refuse, or she should refuse, to talk about a pending investigation with private parties at a fundraiser. And yet the ABA is convinced that there's a First Amendment problem with that. I don't buy it. It seems like they're buying into the philosophy of 5 justices of the Supreme Court and Citizens United, but then taking it yet 3 steps down the road. And this is the American Bar Association. So they're not going to promulgate that basic ethics rule that I requested last year. So I think political conservatives and liberals and moderates always ought to be very concerned about wasteful government spending, excessively complex regulation that favors contributors over competitors, and enforcement of regulation that is perverted by our campaign finance system. So then I look in the next chapter of my book at another group of conservatives, social conservatives. Now, as I said before, I have differed with social conservatives on some issues, and I pointed out the same-sex marriage debate. But I would hate to think that my side won the same-sex marriage debate politically. That's before we went to the Supreme Court of the United States, but that we won politically in Minnesota and other states because of corporate backing. But I can't say that that was a significant part of the strategy that we pursued here in Minnesota with the marriage amendment, was to get the large businesses in Minnesota to emphasize how this would be harmful to their employees. And I think that's all legitimate. But of course, what I am concerned about is the question of whether we won that battle in part, in some places, because of the substantial campaign contributions from corporate PACs that politicians are dependent on. Of course, that was nowhere near enough, apparently, to change the mind of any but a handful of Minnesota state Republicans in the legislature. But in other states, the corporate influence has made a difference with elected officials, and I cannot escape the conclusion that that is in part due to the enormous amount of money funding political campaigns from corporations. So I think the social conservatives, even though they're on the other side of that issue, and where I stood, I would hope have learned a lesson that the corporate wealth is not always going to be on your side. And then in the book I go through the various issues that social conservatives are concerned about. If you really believe in the protection of human life at the beginning and at the end, which includes the giving birth to and the care for a disabled infant or someone at the end of life. And I'm not going to engage in the actual philosophical debate, which has powerful arguments on both sides at the beginning and the end of life. That is not my point here. The point here is that shouldn't those decisions be made on the merits and after a philosophical debate by the people and their elected representatives with respect to weighing human life and other concerns, and when do you have human life, when do you not? And these are important issues in which many people feel strongly on both sides. But should these issues be decided by corporations? Corporations, I think, are insurance companies. What is in the interest of the health insurer? That the child be born or that they not be born? Well, it depends on how fit the child is, or at the end of life, where the vast majority of medical expenses are incurred. What is the interest of the insurance company or the corporation that self-insures for its employees? And I think that on some of those issues, social conservatives ought to think twice before they assume that the campaign finance system is on their side. The pro-life movement in the 80s was run by people who were emphatically opposed to any campaign finance reform. Up through the 1990s, people viciously denouncing John McCain and others as not only anti-American but anti-Christian, somehow for opposing excessive corporate influence on campaigns, on political campaigns. I don't get the logic. And when you look at who stands where on a lot of those issues, it appears not to make any sense to me today either. And then we think of the gambling industry, which used to be a great concern of political conservatives before they turned only to focus on issues having to do with Saxon reelection. But excessive influence of the gambling industry has been particularly of concern in the Republican Party. We've had Sheldon Adelson, the casino man, is one of our top donors to political candidates. I went to one of his affairs about 15 years ago at the Sands Casino in Las Vegas. And you can bet that nobody there would sit around and talk about the immorality of gambling or the threat of gambling to the social structure or into the middle class, and the working class, and those concerns that religious conservatives have had about gambling for a long time. And let's think about the drug industry. No, not the traditional drug industry, but the recreational drug industry that has inroads in 4 states. Of course, would want inroads in other states. There's already a pot pact. You can find that under open secrets. And the industry is very successful wherever you stand on that issue. And we may have differences of opinion among conservatives, libertarians, and others. But this is an industry that is growing in its political influence. Will seek influence in entry into the market in other states. And we know that marijuana is the entry-level product. Most drug dealers know that as well. So there'll be other products that might offer beyond as well. And I see that the recreational drug industry and the pharmaceutical industry, maybe you see some mergers in this deal. Of course, the pharmaceutical industry is already an enormous contributor to political campaigns. But now we have the recreational drug. And then social conservatives talk a lot about school choice. I'm not going to get into specifics of that debate, but how many PACs are there? Political action committees urging that there be school choice, that you ought to be able to get a voucher from the government and send your children to a private school, whether it's a religious school or another school. Very few, very little money on that side of the debate. The National Education Association, a powerful union of teachers in public schools, is adamantly opposed to school choice. And you can look at the Federal Election Commission webpage at opensecrets.org and you can see how much money they put into this. So an issue after issue, I see the social conservatives being marginalized by big campaign money. I agree with social conservatives on some of these issues, disagree on other issues, and then somewhere in between on yet some others, but that's not the point. The question is, with social conservatives, do they really feel that these decisions ought to be made by elected officials under the influence of and dependent upon campaign money, that it's almost all of it going to be coming from people who are on the other side of those issues? And in that chapter of my book, I actually begin the book with a quote. It is a quote from an opinion in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals written by Judge Guido Calabresi, who was the law dean at Yale when I was a student there. And he's a judge in the Second Circuit, and he's a liberal, moderately liberal, so he's one of the few judges who can actually get away with beginning his opinion with a quote from the Gospel of Luke. That is what he does. Calabresi. And his quote is from the story of the widow's mite, where the widow comes up to the donation box. The paupers are there, and the rich men are putting in large amounts. And the widow puts in one little penny. And Jesus says that her penny is as meaningful, if not more so, than all those rich men's donations. And that vision is important to our system of representatory democracy. And that was Guido Calabresi's in that opinion, as it is to the church. And the Citizens United opinion, which Judge Calabresi was directly attacking. He couldn't overrule it, of course, he's just on the Second Circuit, but he certainly could take a shot at it, and that he does. And he does so beginning with the story of the widow's mite. And so this is something I think social conservatives need to take this issue seriously and realize that they don't. If they think they're marginalized today in the Republican Party among elected official conservatives, they're going to be even more marginalized in the future. Then, think about another category of conservatives, the so-called neoconservatives, who are very concerned about our national security situation. Well, let's think of that. Corporate wealth equals free speech. That's the formula in Citizens United. Corporate wealth. Corporations have the First Amendment rights as individuals. It's just they're going to have a lot more money. Now, who says this corporate wealth is American corporate wealth? Well, maybe in the 1950s and 60s, 70s, most corporate wealth was American in the post-war years. Things started to change pretty quickly when we realized that the Japanese and the Germans could build a powerful economy. And now we have the Middle East and China and all over the world. Corporate wealth is exploding. Our system of capitalism has indeed been, we might say, too successful for many parts of the world. Places like communist China that are more capitalist than we are in many ways. There's an enormous amount of corporate wealth all over the world, and a lot of it is coming here. I moved to Weston, and my daughter was in the 5th grade. She made friends with a girl that recently moved here from China. And her father was the head of a big company that had just taken over the Smithfield Foods, which is the sausage manufacturer down in Virginia. And I talked to him, and he talked about how to get that deal done. You had to go down there and go to a lot of NASCAR races and schmooze the good old boys. And, he learned English pretty quickly doing that. But the cross-border transactions are where we are right now, and we're going to more and more of them. And we're going to invest a lot of our money outside the United States. And we're used to that idea. And we, even at the turn of the century, at the turn of the last century, we're used to calling South American countries of our choice banana republic, because we could go down there and invest a lot of money for the United Fruit Company and buy the government. That was the attitude. Well, there's still some of that going on. But of course, we have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that tells our corporations that when it comes to bribery overseas, they at least ought to tone it down a little bit so they don't get caught. What's going on over here? When large corporations from all over the world acquire U.S. businesses, go to joint ventures with U.S. businesses, and I'm all for it. I'm in favor of more international trade and joint investment. I think it's going to help relieve tensions between the United States and China, or the United States and the Middle East. I'm all for it as a matter of economics. The question is, who gets to choose our government? Well, then the answer I hear to that one is, there are laws to deal with this. We put in a law in the 1960s that says it's illegal for a foreign person, foreign national, a company controlled by foreign nationals, to contribute to U.S. political campaigns. And we have some other laws on the books as well. It's just illegal, so it's not happening. Like it's illegal to drink under the age of 21, so it's just not happening. At Harvard, I gave this speech, and I said, well, just go through Harvard Yard on a Saturday night and see how that is. You know, getting foreign money into U.S. political campaigns, I was just a lot easier than getting alcohol on the college campus, even a dry campus. You have a joint venture between the U.S. company and the foreign company. It's a joint venture. Well, the U.S. company makes the contribution. And of course, it's understood who's going to be paying for that contribution. Nobody's dumb enough to put it in an email. Maybe a few people are, and they can get prosecuted. But it's clearly understood that that contribution is going to be made by the American company, yet there's a joint venture with the foreign company, and there's going to be lobbying, maybe not just for that joint venture, but whatever else might be on the agenda of that foreign company. Indeed, if I want to have joint ventures with foreign companies, it might very well be a good strategy for me to make political contributions. Well, Democrat or Republican or whatever. Make the contributions, get the influence. And then I got something to sell. Going to joint venture, I'm not just selling you whatever my role is in the joint venture, but I'm selling access. So Americans will play this game because they can make money playing this game when there's more and more money outside the United States looking for investment opportunities inside the United States. Second, a subsidiary of a foreign-owned company can set up a political action committee and can encourage its suppliers and its employees, all Americans, to make contributions to the political action committee. You don't get foreign contributions to the political action committee, but the foreign company that set up the subsidiary may be calling the shots and telling the Americans who are running that company how to run their political action committee. And then, you don't even need to do it within the scope of the campaign finance system. because a lot of campaign finance isn't campaign finance. It's electioneering communications, 501c4 groups. These are the groups that the Citizens United case said could be funded with corporate money and then make communications about candidates shortly before an election. Whether it's a bad movie about Hillary or something else. Well, the thing with these 501c4 groups is there's no disclosure of who their donors are. We don't know where the money's coming from. A lot of this is dark pools of money from golly knows where. Somewhat like on the stock exchange, you have the listed stocks, and then you have all the trading of derivative products. And all the trading of the actual stocks off the exchange. We call these the dark pools. Nobody knows what's going on over there. But if there is a crisis over here, you can bring the prices down over here. The notion we regulate our financial markets is something that I would challenge. And I have it in my book with Clara Hill that just came out last month on banking. We have the same problem in politics. That a lot of these attack ads and other communications are not being paid for by PACs, by super PACs, by campaigns. They're being paid for by groups who put together an agenda. They say it's an issue-oriented agenda, and yet it is about defeating a particular candidate. It could be SWIFT Vote Veterans for Truth, and one word about John Kerry's war record, or it could be the video and the truth about Benghazi. We're going to see all these groups. And you'll never know where the money comes from. And these groups are going to be funded by the left and by the right in the United States. But increasingly, many of them can and will be funded by foreign interests. So the question is, do we want to continue as an independent country or go back to where we were before the Tea Party and the American Revolution, where the United States, America, was carved up into spheres of influence by foreign powers? England, what is now the United States, France, parts of Canada, Spain down south, and what is now also part of Florida, Texas, Southern California, New Mexico. Do we want to go back to that world? Because our campaign finance system could take us there. And we will have investments abroad. But the question is, do we have the same influence when it comes to choosing who's running the Chinese government, or the Saudi government, or the Russian government, and some of these other countries have the will over our government under this system of campaign finance. So that chapter of my book I title Non-Citizens United, Campaign Finance and the National Security Concern. And then, after going through different categories of conservatives who ought to be very worried about this problem, I get to the question, what are we going to do with that? Yeah, I think the Citizens United case is wrong, as I pointed out. But do we really achieve the objective of campaign finance reform merely by validating that case? Changing it from 5-4, striking down McCain-Feingold to 5-4, upholding the provision of the McCain-Feingold law that said that corporate treasury money and union money can't be used to fund electioneering communications. Is that really going to get us where we want? It will get us part of the way there, I guess, until someone figures out a way around it. Because what is an electioneering communication? I cannot believe that even the most liberal justices of this court would say that Congress could enact a law that prohibit a traditional for-profit movie about a political candidate being produced in an election year, such as think about Fahrenheit 9/11. Michael Moore created this one, about George Bush. And it certainly didn't make it look like the most common president. And that was not the favorite movie in the White House. And this was chosen, and this film, political time, to try and derail his effort for the election. Could you really say that movies are critical of the sitting president of the United States cannot be run in an election year? There is no way I think that any justice would vote for such a law. Well, then, if you can't be critical of the president, well, how about be critical of a candidate for the president who happened to be the former Secretary of State? I mean, if you didn't do this through a 501c4, but just did it through a joint movie venture, find a Hollywood producer who will pursue your agenda, and social conservatives wake up, many of them are not on your side, folks. Isn't it going to be easy? I mean, isn't the campaign finance law that tries to keep money out of the system? Well, I would support it philosophically. Some of my fellow conservatives would not. But if we really rely exclusively on restrictions, is it going to work? Or is it going to be like prohibition with respect to alcohol? It's immoral, we don't like it, says the government. We will tell people they can't do it, and then it's going to happen. Don't we need something else? And my book focuses on getting small donors into the system. We need to engage ordinary Americans with the campaign finance system. And that's where I propose what I call the Taxation Only with Representation Act, or constitutional provision. It expands on the idea we already have here in Minnesota of a tax credit for small donors. But I articulate this in a way that I think ought to appeal to political conservatives. And what I say is that the government and the statute should have language that says, well, the government shall have no right to tax anybody. Now, I know a lot of my fellow conservatives say, that's great, just stop right there. No right to tax anybody. No government, federal, state, or local, should have the right to tax anybody who has not been given the opportunity to allocate the first $200 of the taxes the taxpayer pays toward a candidate, a political party, taxpayer's choice. This is taxation only with representation. And that the right to tax should be conditioned on this fundamental right of American citizens to participate in the system in a meaningful way. And this means not just voting on election day, but having influence over who the candidates are in the primary process. And we are sick and tired of hearing stories that say, well, so-and-so may drop out of the primary because they don't have enough money. Wait a minute, we never got a chance to even vote yet. We don't have the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary until next year. And there's a Minnesota caucus. Well, wait a minute, we're going to have our Republican candidates winnow down ahead of time based on money? So who's choosing? Is it a traditional Republican primary? Is it the Koch brothers primary? Or somebody else's primary? And the point of the Taxation Only with Representation Act is that the government that's chosen in that way shouldn't have a right to taxes. And if we want a government that's going to be taxing us, they should give us at least that opportunity to have a meaningful choice in who those government officials are who are going to be deciding how much the taxes ought to be and how they're going to spend, some people might say waste, the money. And if we don't get that opportunity, we should be taxed. Now, as I say, I'm trying to describe this in a way that I appeal to at least some conservatives. So far, not too much traction. When my friends at Take Back Our Republic have taken this up on the Hill, we'll talk to them. But a lot of traction with some retired members of Congress and others. And that's the idea I'd like to discuss with everyone here. So I'd like to open up the discussion and questions and comments.
Let's have some questions.
So you mentioned one way of sort of leveling the playing field is by electing on your 1040 to give the first $200 to a candidate or a party of your choosing. What I'm curious about is how would you handle a candidate like Trump, for instance, or another billionaire who sits on $300 million in cash ready to spend, or Soros, or you name your politically engaged billionaire? Because it seems to me that if they are electing to run and elect to not take any contributions, that it would be very hard still to counter them. Not impossible, of course, but very hard. So what would you suggest or recommend for those candidates, if anything?
Yeah, I think, okay, the first part thing I want to comment is I think the idea we have is just claim it on the tax form probably makes sense, but in this day and age with the internet, you really ought to be able to go in and just sort of get this done on the internet using a password, a social security or something. I know that the current administration has some issues with the internet site for the health. but I'd like to actually get some tech people in there and know what they're doing and let anybody go on in there with the social security number. The reason this is important is that some people don't even have an income tax, and they ought to have this right too, because they pay a sales tax. A homeless person pays $200 in sales tax. I don't think you can live in this country without shelling out $200 to the government. And so every citizen ought to have this right, not just those who file the 1040. And second, it shouldn't be able to pay it now and collect it later, because $200 means a lot to people who can't pay their bills on time. And I could shell out $200, claim the credit, and go through the paperwork. Someone else may not be able to handle the cash flow. So I'd say you ought to just be able to go online and use the appropriate security and choose your candidate. And we ought to develop a system that's secure that does that. And expand use. And I think you have a lot more expanded use of this tax credit than if you do it the traditional way through the tax reform. Now, on the other hand, though, and this is where I differ from Larry Lessig, who was advocating vouchers. And he would restrict the voucher and say they can't go to campaigns or receive money from too many other sources. And I don't know what he did about Donald Trump. But I find that I don't want to do that, because I want to get back to, this is about the right of the taxpayer. First $200 can't be your choice. And I don't want to stray from that too much. Start making exceptions, and you start playing into the arguments that people have against it. This is just a great big nanny state telling you what to do with your money. And it's not. It's about making a choice. So you want to give $200 of your taxpayer money to Donald Trump. Okay, fine. It's not where I put it. I don't want to. Maybe I shouldn't even talk about these candidates here in the government university. Everyone knows it's not my favorite, but that most people though are going to be looking for candidates who reflect their interests. But it might be. I mean, Kennedy had a very rich family and so forth. President Kennedy and other Kennedys who run for the presidency.
Okay, ask a follow-up, sorry. It seems that in order to have this campaign finance reform, you also would have to do ballot access reform, right? Because if it's premised on the idea that an individual taxpayer should be able to elect to give their money to a certain candidate, but that candidate is foreclosed for reasons from getting on the ballot access in one of another state, how effective then?
Yeah, I mean, that's a different issue. That's a serious concern. But ballot access is complex, and of course you need expensive lawyers to work it out. And that's one of the problems. We've raised the cost of campaigns through some of the regulatory regime. And that's another thing I read about, think about the ways to try and lower the cost of campaigning by simplifying the regulatory regime. And that would help a lot. So yes, it does tie to a lot of other issues.
You mentioned Lessig's position on this one issue in contrast with your own. Overall, if you had to summarize in brief comments your differences from Lessig, how would you do it?
I think I'd say on that, on the issue of who ought to be able to get the money. But I have openly acknowledged, and I said it in the book, that I changed the language here. But Lessig's idea of, he calls it a voucher. I call it a tax rebate or tax refund. That basically what I'm doing is saying that the idea of tax vouchers, which is, we've done it here in Minnesota before Larry Lessig was the idea, that this is an idea that needs to be pursued on the national level. But I would not advocate restrictions on who you can give it to, except for some arguments have been made that I find somewhat convincing ought to be someone you're eligible to vote for. So you don't have all the Chicago people dumping money into downstate primaries in Illinois, or New Yorkers into upstate primaries. So it might be a restriction based on who you're eligible to vote for, and I'm open to that. I would not go any further, because otherwise it looks like the government is trying to tell you what you do with your money. So that's my principal difference with Larry Lessig, and also what I would call it. I like the tax rebate, tax refund, rather than a voucher. The voucher sort of sounds like, well, it's the government's money and they're giving it to you. And my focus is, wait, whose money was it to begin with? It was my money. And the first $200 of my money, I ought to get to choose who's going to spend the rest. So it's clear, and I explained this in my book. This is not new art. We've already been doing it in Minnesota to some extent.
Where does the number come from?
$200. Try to guess how many people would participate. Maybe 75%. I came up with get about $8 million into the system every 2 years. You had $200 in each election season. It would be $200 a year, or $200 every 2 years. You can play around with the number. But I think that that's enough money that can allow other candidates to get in there and have a shot, other than the well-funded candidates, and also diminish the dependency relationship that candidates have with the big donors, and that the office holders have with the big donors. In other words, I can alienate a big donor, and yet if I'm popular among the people who vote for me, and they can each send me $200 because I stood up to the big corporate interests or whoever it is, I still have a shot at having a big enough campaign in order to run for re-election. So that's enough money, I think, to mitigate the dependency relationships with big donors in most cases. See, the more money you throw out, I hate to say as a conservative, where you throw money at the rock, you're going to solve it. But you know, we're already put a ton of money into campaigns. And I disagree with those people who say there's too much money in politics. The problem is where the money's coming from. There's too little of our money in politics, the 99.9%, and too much of the 0.1%, 0.01%. Well, there's another point I'm making. Because even the richest Americans are disadvantaged by this system. And we think about the broad priorities that most of the richest Americans have based on polling data and so forth, that on the issues that people care about, including the richest Americans, many of those issues, it's very hard to get any traction through campaign contributions. Where you get traction through campaign contributions is when you're trying to get something for yourself or your own company at the expense of everyone else. And Larry Lessig has an example of these plastics they use in toys and baby bottles, and that they may be carcinogenic. Well, you know, the rich person could be as worried about that as everyone else, except for maybe the rich person who manufactures the plastics. They may have a different view. And an issue after issue, where you ask, what is the interest of the public? Believe it or not, the very well-to-do have similar interests with the rest of us in many respects. And that's an aspect of this debate that's been lost when the progressive reform proponents characterize it as a class warfare type of thing, as an us versus them. The rich are calling the shots. And you do find some of that Larry Lessig's rhetoric, more so in some of his supporters. And I want to back off the thing, say, and this is what I described in my book, it's a situation that is a lot worse than even if you did the, I think, very undemocratic thing of saying to the top 0.01%, okay, you guys get to run the show. It is worse. It is more dysfunctional. It leads to worse results. This is not taking the United States back to England before the 1832 Reform Act. It's even worse.
Do you think access to free social media sites like Facebook and Twitter has or will have an effect on the amount of money it takes to run a successful campaign?
I think it could. And that's something I point out in the book. It depends, of course, on how much free access there is. And the internet access debate is another one that Larry Lessig and others have been involved with. You know, if we are going to have the internet dominated by those who can pay for access to sites, or this, you know, you go and you Google something, you're going to get the site of the person who paid the most quickly. You know, I think that a lot of that advantage is going to evaporate. So it depends on how social media sites are run and on the regulatory regime there. But there's a lot of hope that with the internet, with social media, that the cost of campaigning could go down because there are more different media outlets. It isn't just get television ads on the three major networks. There are lots of ways to reach the public, and that should lower costs. I've yet to see how that actually plays out. But I think it could lower costs, and you get the small donor dollar money in, and then use those internet sites to encourage people to allocate their $200 or whatever toward the campaign, choice. I think there's some avenue of hope here, absolutely.
Could we also see an issue where we have the opposite problem, that social media, through flamboyant statements, are making it cheaper for other candidates to run who really wouldn't have been able to garner the support they would have without it? Case in point, Donald Trump, you look at the money he's spending, and his campaign is kind of running on, he has tons of money, but he hasn't spent a lot of money because he has all this publicity out there on social media and places.
Basically, the amount of social media out there is at the crazy factor.
Yeah.
Crazy. Because at least if you're at an ad on ABC television, and ABC News might be there to counter it, and at least people knew the difference between an ad and a news program. And there's some balance there. I mean, notice this every the New York Times, you see some of these full-page ads, particularly involves the Middle East and some other stuff. Well, where did this all come from? But people know that's an ad as well as turn to the editorial page or somewhere in the news. That now in the social media it's just all mixed up. So the crazy factor gets in there, and stuff that is described as news, and it's not really news. And that's a problem. And we're going to have that problem in the internet age anyway. And is the internet going to be a tool for democracy, where there's high quality debate by an informed citizenry, or is it going to be dominated by those who just throw the most money at it and use it to manipulate public opinion? The use of mass media to influence public opinion has been a problem for a long time, going back to Germany in the 1930s and those very dramatic movies that they would make at those rallies. And in the worst world, I mean, the internet can become that way. And that's a serious concern. I'm not sure it's directly the same as the campaign finance problem, but it's a serious concern.
Isn't there some concern that given the amount of money that a lot of these really wealthy corporate donors have, that if we create a system where more people participate, it'll create kind of a race to the top where the amount of money necessary to make an impact is just going to keep going up, and candidates will go to these corporations and say, now there's this other money in the system, you need to give me more so that I can outweigh this messaging they're doing, and we end up with the same situation we have now.
You get the money race, then in fact what's going to happen is that people are going to make their $200 donations, and then what's going to happen is the big money is just going to make the difference on the top as to who wins. So you have the same dependency relationship. Now that assumes that the $200 people are going to be evenly distributed. So that'll be evenly distributed, and then the corporations will come in and make the difference. So there are two things that I would hope. One is the lower cost of political campaigns with the social media options and so forth might make it possible to break in with less money. We've yet to see if that's going to happen. And the second is that if there is at least some disclosure of what's going on here at the top. We're not going to get perfect disclosure. But as much disclosure as we can get of what's going on at the top, that informed voters can use that information, not just on election day, but when they allocate their $200 and make up for it in that way. But yes, we do run the risk of a race for more and more money. But we got that today. I don't think we can necessarily turn off the spigot by reversing citizens united. It's just what we're going to do is create some more regulations people are trying to work their way around. But I think we need to get small donors into the system. And there are other ideas I got in the book, by the way. For example, instead of all these free voucher programs like frequent buyer programs, I'm fine with my frequent flyer miles. I'm tired of these frequent buyer things like the Caribou and all that. I just can't do it. I can't get those things in my wallet. Why don't we have something, I call it democracy dollars. I'm trying to get businesses to buy into this. If I buy a cup of coffee, give me 5 cents toward the democracy dollars account. And then have them in a whole bunch of stores. And Target could say, instead of donating money to somebody running for governor and all, oh boy, was that a mess. Say, what we're going to do now is our customers get to make the decision. So you got a democracy dollars account, we'll contribute, 1% to there. Buy at Target. And you can use this in a range of different places. So I think there are private sector solutions that could be implemented, bring in even more small dollar through promotions by businesses. And I was hoping to get the business community engaged with that, get an entrepreneur, that could be for profit, like a green stamps program or whatever. Instead of pasting the silly stamps in the book and getting some silly toy or something, you'd actually get to have democracy dollars to go toward a campaign of your choice. And that could supplement the $200. So I think there's room for the private sector to get involved.
Who are your biggest supporters or potential supporters now, either individuals or organizations, and who are your most formidable opponents, individuals or organizations, toward the effectuation of this idea?
I think the current leadership in the House and the Senate seems quite opposed to anything that would change the campaign finance system. They know, though, that the vast majority of the voters, including conservative voters, are fed up. Poll after poll shows that self-identified conservative voters generally don't have views on this that are any different than self-identified liberals. So at the grassroots level, I think we have a lot of support among conservatives as well as moderates and liberals. It's at the very top, the people who are in office. There are quite a few former office holders who have very strongly embraced the cause of campaign finance reform. Former Governor of Kentucky of New York, Emil Houghton, Congressman of New York, Buddy Romer. I mean, the list goes on. There. Well, quite a few.
Can you explain that? Why would it be that?
Because they're no longer dependent on this money. When they say this system is corrupt, they don't tick anybody up. Who can then pull the plug? Because they pulled the plug themselves. They said, I've had it. No, I'm retiring. I'm going to do something else. And so they're willing to say no to the big money. I think the problem is on the Democrat side, you do have sitting office holders who are willing to say no, that the system needs to be changed. But there's a certain amount of hypocrisy on this. One is they continue to get a lot of money. Second, the solution you hear on the liberal side is constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. Well, we all know that's not going to happen. So how do you overturn Citizens United? Replace one Supreme Court justice. We had a Supreme Court justice over at the law school last week, Justice Scalia. He's getting older. Well, someday, well, he's going to stick around for a long time, but there'll be a retirement. We get a liberal justice, and 5-4, and all the world's problems will be solved. So how are we going to do that? We got to elect a Democrat as president, give him or her, it's going to be her, a Democratic Senate, confirm the justice. Well, that package comes with a lot of other benefits for the liberal side, right? Will give us campaign finance reform? Well, they give us the free Citizens United, wonderful world I described in the last chapter of this book, which is better than after Citizens United, but it comes with all those pennies. So on the Democrat side, the liberal side, there can be more support for campaign finance reform, but it tends to be targeted in that strategic direction. Less emphasis on the taxpayer. On the others, Congressman Sarbanes of Maryland has proposed something similar to what I want. I mean, I think there's some integrity over on that side of the aisle as well. But you see, at least the liberals are dealing with issues. What I'm telling the conservatives is you stick your head in the sand. You say there's not a problem. When 80% of the voters say there's a problem, including 80% of the conservative voters, you're at the answers with your head in the sand. At some point, someone's going to come up and give you a boot in the rib. It's not going to be pleasant. So I think this is an issue where I think conservatives get themselves outsmarted and pretty quickly by those liberals who at least are willing to say there is a problem. And that's the first step. And then we can talk about the solutions later.
Could you speculate on if there's, I guess we'll have to wrap up, but I'm curious, is there a foreign policy issue that you see the dark hand of excess money on right now? Let's say the top of the list.
It's hard to figure that out because when you look at covert operations to influence the United States government or to spy on the United States government or whatever, this is highly sophisticated. We know, where the money is. I mean, China is a powerful country. A country I would like to see be friends with the United States. I'd like to see more deals with China, more business deals. But there are differences in opinion. And I just cannot imagine it would have large amounts of Chinese investment in the United States and have the corporations making those investments, who are many of them beholden to Chinese government, not weigh in on some of those issues, for better or worse. Now, you could argue that it might be for our interest, because you get some of these hawks, marginalized in foreign policy who won't end up in a war. Then maybe it's in our interest, but the question is that democracy? Are we choosing our government? So I think there is a large source of money, a country with interests that in many areas are consistent with our interests, but there are differences of opinion. And the other is the Middle East. I mean, we hear over and over again about the Israel lobby. Now, I have differed with the Israel lobby on a number of issues. Of course, the Israel lobby is now split into AIPAC, very hawkish, and a J Street that is more in favor of peace. But my point is, if we're going to talk about money in the Middle East, let's not just talk about the now two different groups that don't agree with each other with respect to Israel. Don't tell me that we're not going to have any Saudi money, any money from any other country in the Middle East coming into our political system when you have sovereign wealth funds. They're then in turn investing in private equity funds in the United States. They're making undisclosed investments in the United States companies. So to discuss the money in American politics that pertains to the Middle East as if it's about the two different parts of the Israel lobby, I think it's only part of the picture, and I can't imagine those countries standing down. And finally, President Putin, my favorite. I gave a speech on this basic talk at the National Press Club in May, and the chairman of the Federal Election Commission, Ann Reynolds, she came. The former chairman of the FEC, Trevor Potter, he was there on the panel with me. He's one of my fellow Republicans who backs campaign finance reform. They're all there. It's at USA Today sent some reporter. And then the other news reporter who asked me all sorts of questions afterward was a young woman from Sputnik. And Sputnik wrote this up the very next day. It was right up there on the website in English and in Russian, I'm sure on President Putin's desk first thing in the morning, about how foreign money can get into U.S. political campaigns. And I'm sure that to the extent there's any money left over there, and once again, you don't need to have an advocacy-rich country in order to do this. You just need concentration of wealth in the hands of people who want to influence our government. And President Putin, with all due respect, is certainly not in poverty. Neither are his friends. His enemies are off somewhere else in Siberia. And I don't think that there would be a lack of desire to influence our government there. So those are three hot spots. But of course I can't prove it. No more I can prove so-and-so's a Russian spy. And I don't want to get into that game. It's how do we prevent it? And we're not preventing it now.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, pretty much so much.